All right, now let's take a look at some future trends in financial planning. This is a profession of constant change, right? And so here's a quote that I like. The only thing that is constant is change. For anybody that's been on this earth for any amount of time, you would probably strongly agree with this statement. And as I already said, this definitely applies to the profession that we practice in. So when we look at a report put forth by IMCA, we see that they make some estimations on what financial services industry is going to look like in 2030. In full disclosure, this report came out 2 or 3 years ago, and I don't think they even fully considered the impact that artificial intelligence was going to have on how people operate. So we don't see a whole lot of that that's integrated into this conversation, but we certainly expect that as AI becomes more robust and sophisticated, that will be an additional factor that impacts how we practice and serve our clients. Ultimately, what we get through all of the resources provided by technology is not a disconnection from our clients, from overdependence on technology, but more capacity to be more relational with our clients and provide the coaching and counseling and support that those clients really need to maximize their satisfaction over the course of their lifetime. We certainly see this as the CFP board starts to integrate and make requirements associated with the softer side of financial planning more and more prominent in their principal knowledge topics. They've recently started requiring an increased emphasis on the psychology of financial planning, which provides additional insight into counseling and client communication, and some of those things that are definitely more relational with regards to the benefits that we provide when working with our clients. Okay, so we expect to see a greater increase in the fiduciary standard across the industry as time goes on. This is great, right? This prevents bad players from being successful in our marketplace, which, as we talked about in the last lecture, increases perception of the industry and increases trust in the industry. Now, by default, with improved perception and increased trust, we also have higher quality players that want to participate in this marketplace. So we start to attract more talented people, more committed people, more altruistic people, and the profession continues to grow in a positive way. Right? We also expect to see the wealth gap become less pronounced, right? There'll be some leveling of the playing field with regards to just wealth in the population in general. But equally so, we expect to see a less pronounced wealth gap in who financial planners serve. Again, with technology integrations that improve efficiency, we can serve more clients so that people that have a preference in working with clients that may be of a little bit lower income or lower net worth will have the capacity to do so. And so we'll be able to serve greater people with more different needs and impact the whole market that demands financial advice in a more meaningful way, right? We'll see increasing diversity in clients. We'll see increasing diversity in culture amongst those practicing in the profession. As I already said, technology is going to play a big role. And with increased technology, an increase in demand for transparency. We've seen a lot of these things start to bubble up in the profession, but we expect that those things will definitely continue. Okay. Now the future of advice, right? I can think back to when I started as a professor, which wasn't terribly a long time ago. But let's go back 10 years, and I would go to a professional conference and it was almost completely and totally dominated by, what type of portfolio advice are we going to get? And then it transitioned a little bit into, well, what type of retirement income advice are we going to give? And now when I go to conferences, it's almost completely dominated with, how are we going to serve our clients well holistically? The whole person, right? Financially, emotionally, spiritually, physically, right? Health and wealth are so connected. And so there's just been this evolution. Now, I'm not saying that portfolio management isn't still important or retirement income planning isn't still important, but we have some efficiencies that allow us to manage that part of the relationship with less time commitment so that we can dedicate more time, again, to the relational things when working with a client, right? We'll be able to serve clients from anywhere, anytime. I remember Michael Kitces, one of the most prolific writers and bloggers in the financial planning space, probably for the last 15 years, told a story about a hospital executive that was one of his clients. And he basically said, hey, listen, I'm in the greater DC area, and this client is in his late 30s to early 40s. And I said, hey, listen, your quarterly review's coming up. We have you scheduled for a meeting in office at 2:30 this Wednesday. And the client showed up to that meeting. As you can imagine, as a hospital executive, this person is extremely busy. And he said, I didn't even talk about anything financial planning in that meeting. The guy walked in, sat down at the meeting. He said, if I ever have to come back to a meeting in person again with your firm, I am going to find a new firm. Basically, what he was saying is that there's a better way to do this, right? We can meet anywhere, anytime, virtually, and you can service my needs. And so what that means for financial planners is they're probably going to work with their existing clients in a different way, as we see in our current business practices and all other domains today. And what it also means is they're going to be able to access additional clients, right? Now I can work with the expat that lives in Belize that just sold their business, and I can manage that relationship virtually. And so there's so much that technology is going to allow us to build our businesses, to expand our businesses, to work with niche clients, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, kind of what we see in just kind of the evolution of this is a changing conversation. Okay. We're seeing a whole lot more of an increased focus related to aging, health and wealth, the family structure, and then also how are we going to take these resources and really add satisfaction to my life? Before, well, I shouldn't say before. My research agenda has always been over not necessarily the technical strategies associated with retirement income planning, but how people feel about taking retirement income out of their portfolios to spend, right? And so when we think about the evolution that we've talked about on previous slides, really this isn't, you need to, rely this much on Social Security. We need to annuitize this portion of your portfolio. We need to keep this part invested in financial assets for liquidity and growth. It's not about the technical aspects. It's about how do you feel about spending this money, right? We told you to save this money for the last 40 years and don't touch it for any reason whatsoever. Now I'm telling you to take it out and spend it down. And people don't feel very good about that, right? And so how can we make you more comfortable and relate the spending actions to the achievement of the satisfaction that motivated the savings years before? And so it's a changing conversation, not about portfolio management, but about satisfaction management as we shift behaviors in different phases of the planning process. We're going to have younger clients that are more dependent on technology, and the increased need for transparency is definitely going to impact compensation models. Assets under management, AUM, is still a very common compensation model. When I first, again, came into this profession, it was basically this huge flee from commission-based structures into AUM-based structures. More transparency, right? And now clients are kind of saying, and firms are agreeing, like, hey, that AUM is a little bit less transparent than I want it to be. And so let's go to a fee-based structure. And when I say fee-based, let me be more clear. Let's go to like a retainer structure. Flat fee based on the complexity of my plan year to year. Tell me what you're going to charge me to provide the services that we've agreed upon. And so we see a whole lot of that as we move forward. So even this graphic that we see isn't perfectly representative of what exists in today's marketplace or even the trend that we're expecting moving forward. we know that robo advice, whether it be through portfolio management or other AI solutions, is definitely changing the way that we deal with a lot of the technical aspects of this profession. Yeah, and you know, when we look at this, robo is not our biggest threat to the success of our profession, right? It's how do we deal with the changing client, right? How do we really service their needs well to provide value that is long lasting, right? People have more access to information. So how do we communicate value in the presence of additional information on the topics that we're providing advice on? People are living longer. How do we convince people that the best actions to take are impacted by life expectancy that's ever increasing? And the list goes on and on and on. And so our biggest threat to the profession is not how technology changes, but it's how we adapt to changing client needs. And if we can do that well, we can thrive in this space because we'll always be valuable to our clients because we're in tune with the needs that best suit satisfaction maximization. If we stay still and don't adapt to the changes that take place in the client landscape, then our value add proposition will be out of date. All right, guys, I think there's a lot of exciting things. I think in a nutshell, what I'd like to close this with is whatever lights your fire in this profession, there's an opportunity to do it. Whoever you want to serve and however you want to serve them, whether it be face-to-face, behind the scenes, or anywhere in between, you have the ability to impact futures of people in a meaningful way. So stay tied into what's going on in the profession. Take on a mentality of a lifetime learner and enjoy enhancing and improving the lives of the people that you serve in whatever capacity you serve them in. And if you do that, I think that you'll always find a reward from being a part of this profession. I'm not saying it'll always be easy, but you'll be able to go home day in and day out and know that you made a difference and that the difference you make is sustainable and impactful. So I've thoroughly enjoyed this semester. I've thoroughly enjoyed teaching you guys. I hope you learned some things that are meaningful to the rest of your education in this program and meaningful to how you engage as a professional once you enter the workplace. Thank you for your attention, and always know that you can reach out to me with any needs that you have. I'm always happy to lend a helping hand.